hosted the event. This is about an hour and 10 minutes.
Thank you, Jim. That was a really nice introduction, and I love that you work the Bruce Springsteen references. You know, when I'm at events, often I'll be talking about all the stuff that's going on in the world, and I'll point to someone and say, Bruce Springsteen is my favorite artist. I've seen him 30 times in concert. And I'll say, but one of the problems in the world right now is we tend to talk about averages, but averages don't mean anything. And I'll point to someone and say, for example, if you, me, and the boss were having lunch at a table having 3 burgers, someone would look at that table and say, see that table over there? Those people, they have 17 Grammys on average each. But we all know that wouldn't tell the whole story of what's going on at that lunch or in the world. But Jim, thank you for that really nice introduction. It's so great to be here at such an iconic event, which is the only way I could describe it. You know, when my wife and I made the decision to go into public service, about 10 years ago, my wife and I decided to dedicate the rest of our lives to public service. We felt like we had been very blessed. Jim told you a little bit about my background. I grew up in a blue-collar family. My dad was an electrician. He was in a union. The union really helped me not only provide a decent living for our family, but it actually paid for half of my tuition at Columbia University, which I never would have been able to go but for that union. Then I went to Georgetown Law School, where the best thing that could have ever happened to me happened, which is I met my wife, and we decided to stay in the Washington area. She's from Idaho. Her dad was a potato farmer, so the son of the union electrician from Jersey meets the daughter of the Idaho potato farmer in Georgetown, and we stayed in Washington, and we've been very blessed with 4 daughters. My oldest is 26, my youngest is 11, so I appreciate all the kids who are here from both St. A's and I think from New England College. You all are here too somewhere. I said hello to you earlier, so I appreciate all the young people coming out. 8 o'clock in the morning for a college student is not a normal posting, having had now 2 through college and 1 on the way. And then I became a successful entrepreneur. I started these 2 businesses. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. So we felt like we had been very blessed, and we wanted to dedicate the rest of our lives to public service. In many ways, I always thought of my life as a third learning, a third earning, and a third serving. And we wanted to get on with that chapter of our lives of public service. But my wife, who's much smarter than me, had a beautiful framing for that decision to enter public service. She said it's going to be an amazing journey, and you're going to meet extraordinary people, and she said it'll be the most enriching experience in our lives. And she was right. And those of you who had the privilege to serve, you know what I'm talking about. But this is part of that journey, coming to an event like this, having the opportunity to have breakfast with great folks like you, and be part of this amazing tradition we have as a nation where we select our leaders every 4 years, and we ask ourselves the most important question, which is what's next? What's next for our nation? What's next for our people? What's next for our future? What's next for our world? Because that's what the presidential election is really about. It's about answering that question. And so this is an amazing experience, and I'm really grateful to be here. The other thing that happens when you run for president, within 24 hours of announcing, you get about 40 or 50 calls. You're hoping they're from the Sunday morning talk shows, inviting you on. But most of them are from people who are calling you up and saying, well, when is your book coming out? And I said to myself, well, I didn't realize when I ran for president that I had to write a book. But that's also part of this iconic journey. And so I wrote a book. It's called The Right Answer. I think we have copies here for you, but I wanted to talk about it a little bit because it does frame my approach to politics and public service. The title of the book is called The Right Answer, and it comes from a speech that then Massachusetts Senator John F. Kennedy gave in 1958 in Baltimore, Maryland. He was at a college, so it's probably kind of a similar event. He was at Loyola in Baltimore. And he said, we should not seek the Republican answer. We should not seek the Democratic answer. We should seek the right answer. We shouldn't seek to refight the battles of the past. We should own our responsibility for our future as Americans. And I thought those were beautiful lines. And what was interesting about the speech is he gave it 4 weeks after Sputnik was launched. And if you go back and read the history books in 1958, that generation of Americans, they were closer to World War II than we are to 9/11, just to put it into perspective. That generation of Americans rightly believed they had saved the world, because they did. They defeated fascism. And suddenly, with one rocket into space, they were panicked. They thought they were going to lose their future. If you read about what they were thinking about what this chapter meant, they had no idea what was next. But great leaders like John Kennedy stepped forward, and others, and they said, listen, it's our future to write. It's our future to build. But what we have to do is we have to build it together as Americans. Not as Democrats, not as Republicans, but as Americans. And we did. And I believe we're at a very similar moment as we stand here today. I do think the central question facing this country, more than any particular piece of policy, is how do we take this terribly divided nation, where American is increasingly pitted against American, where the American people are told that your enemy is your fellow American, where our political leaders walk around and act like half of the country is entirely wrong about everything they believe. And how do we turn the page on that? And how do we restore a sense of common purpose and unity to this extraordinary country, this magnificent country, where we can solve every problem that we're confronted with, but we have to solve it together? How do we get back to that? Which doesn't mean we agree with each other on everything. Far from it. We shouldn't want to live in a world where we agree with each other on everything. We should want politics to be the battle of ideas, right, where we're trying to convince people of the right direction for our country. But there also has to be some time spent in our political debate where we actually focus on the things we agree with each other on. And we come together around those things. And we actually get things done. And when I talk to young people, I really do encourage them to think about themselves as pragmatic idealists, because that's really what our country needs. We certainly want to be striving. We certainly want to be answering that question about what's next. We certainly want to be building kind of what I call the next stage of good, where we get back to a sense of moral aspiration in our politics. But we also have to be solving some of these problems. We have to be working together. We can't be always moving the goalposts. And it is an incredibly important time to do it right now, because I think the pace of change that's occurred in our society is only accelerating. I mean, across the last several decades, between technological innovation and globalization, two forces that have been extraordinary, transformative, helped billions of people around the world. But they've also left huge parts of our own society behind. And why did that happen? Because we didn't do anything about it. We just fought politically, right? We watched our whole economy change. We watched our standing in the world change. We watched the nature of work change. And we didn't do the basic things we should have done to the institutions in our society to prepare people for it. And in my judgment, and I know there's some people in the room who are much closer to technological innovation even than I am, the pace of these changes is accelerating. And it will have a profound effect not only on the future of work in this country. It's estimated that by 2030, 50 million jobs in the United States of America will either be displaced or fundamentally changed based on automation or artificial intelligence. It's changing our national security risks and our posture, particularly around cyber. It's changing the nature of our society, how people consume the news. Right? More than half of the American people receive their news from social media. Yet if you ask the social media companies, they'll be the first to say that they're not journalistic enterprises. Right? It's changing our basic privacy. These are very important things occurring. And we actually have to start doing things to prepare our society. I mean, if we were sitting here with a whiteboard and charting out the future, we wouldn't get it precisely right, but we would be directionally correct about what our society needs. It needs a better education system, Right? Last year, according to the U.S. military, 71% of the high school graduates in the United States of America were not eligible for the military. So 7 out of 10 high school grads couldn't qualify for the military. Obviously, we're not giving our high school grads enough to prepare them for the world. Right? So if we were sitting here thinking about the future, clearly we build an education system, which I think should start at pre-K. It's by far the best investment we make. The data is overwhelming. And we would give kids something after high school. I call it pre-K through 14. Every kid should get at least 2 years of community college as part of basic public education, or at least 2 years of career and technical training as part of basic public education. We'd reform our healthcare system, right? My dad, the union electrician, had one job for 60 years. It made some sense to have your healthcare tied to your job if you were going to have one job. But I think my 4 daughters, they may have 10, 15 jobs. Does it make any sense in the future to have our healthcare tied to your job, just as a matter of economics, putting aside the fact that I view healthcare as a basic human right of every citizen in a country as wealthy as ours? But even in our healthcare debate, right, we made a big step forward with the Affordable Care Act. Clearly, what I think we should be doing is fixing that. That's what you were doing if you actually wanted to help people. You'd roll up your sleeves, you'd get in a room, and you'd improve the Affordable Care Act. And then you'd get on to a conversation about how we actually create a universal healthcare system. But you wouldn't create a universal healthcare system by throwing out the whole healthcare system we have right now, which is 1/6 of the U.S. economy. If it was its own country, it would be one of the largest countries in the world. That's not how you would create universal healthcare, by saying we're going to just throw the whole system out and start from scratch. If you were actually trying to serve the common good of the country, you'd fix the Affordable Care Act. You'd say, how do we create universal health care within the context of the system we have now so we actually can deliver results? We're leaving our children both a fiscal and environmental debt that they cannot repay. And you can't sugarcoat that statement at all, because it's true. If you look at the fiscal trajectory of this country, where we have 5% deficits at a time we have record low unemployment, and if you look at the climate debt we're leaving the next generation, where the data keeps getting worse and worse, because that's really what it is. If you look at Boston, I give this presentation, and I'll use Boston as an example because we're close to Boston. If you project what climate change will do to Boston by 2100, most of the city will be underwater. Now, as a practical matter, the city won't be underwater, not because the seas won't rise, but because Boston will build walls around itself. And it'll create pumps that none of us can ever imagine. And it'll have technologies that none of us can even envision to save that city from going underwater, because it's worth it to do that. But the point there is that's a debt we're leaving the next generation, because they're going to have to spend that money. And that will be a drain on their prosperity. So if you actually wanted to deal with climate change, you would take the approach that I'm taking, which is I introduced in the last Congress a bipartisan carbon tax bill. Puts a price on carbon. Fundamentally change how people use fossil fuels. Columbia University estimates it'll lower greenhouse gases by 92% by 2040. We take all the money raised from the carbon tax and we give it back to the American people in a dividend, 100% of it. And we actually say you can take that dividend and put it in a tax-free retirement account, or a tax-free health savings account, or a 527 plan. So suddenly we're taking a big problem like climate change and we're dealing with it in a way that it's actually good for the American people. Right? Those are the kind of things we need to do, because those are the kind of things we can get done now. That bill has bipartisan support. And I emphasize this proposal in contrast to this Green New Deal that came out, which I certainly support the energy behind it. And I certainly support the fact that it's put a lot of attention on this incredibly important issue. But I don't support the notion of making it harder to get something done on climate change, right? Because climate change is an exponential problem. It's not a linear problem, right? The sooner we act, the better. The longer we act, the worse. So what we should be doing, again, going back to that notion, let's not think about the Democratic answer or the Republican answer. Let's find the right answer. What we should be doing is getting ourselves in a room, getting a carbon tax bill done, which I believe you can do in this country. I believe there's sufficient support among Republicans, particularly coastal Republicans, to get that done. And then we should be saying, okay, what else do we got to do? Well, we got to innovate our way out of the problem, because that's what the American people have always done. And we should increase our investment in basic energy research by 5-fold. Because if you look back across time, how did the United States of America solve problems? Well, we always solved it by innovation. And climate is a problem you can actually only truly innovate your way out of. So this is my approach to politics, which is I consider myself, just like the advice I give young people, a pragmatic idealist. I'm thinking about where the world is going, how these tremendous forces of global interconnections and technological innovation are changing every aspect of our society, our economy, our national security, how we interact with each other as human beings. And I'm thinking about how do we update the basic social compact in our society so that more of our citizens can thrive. Because that's not what's happening today. You know, last year in our country, 80% of the professionally managed venture capital, so you know the smart money, 80% of that went to 50 counties in the United States of America. There are 3,100 counties in this country. 50 of them got 80% of the smart money. That's not a country of opportunity. That's a country of birthright, where you have to be born in the right city or go to the right school to have a shot. It shouldn't surprise anyone that this generation of Americans, these young people sitting at these tables, is the first generation in our country's history that will not do better than their parents. Right? If you were born in 1950, you had a 90% chance of earning more than your parents. If you were born in 1980, that was down to 50%. 2010, they estimated 20%. So we've watched the American dream go from something that every American pretty much had to where 1 in 5 of our citizens. But the reason is not because our model is fundamentally broken, not because the core strengths of this country, liberty, freedom, a free market system, a rule of law unmatched anywhere in the world. It's because of our elected officials have failed our people. And they failed our people by their refusal to actually seek compromise, find common ground, and get basic things done that we need to do to improve our society and prepare the next generation. Whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's technology policy, whether it's building infrastructure, whether it's digital privacy, whatever the case may be, there are solutions for all of these issues. But we have to come together to do it. So how am I going to do it as president? Because that's the obvious question. Well, I think leadership matters. I think the tone at the top that is set by the president is the most important thing in terms of changing how the American people perceive their country and perceive themselves. I think a president should not talk about half the country as if they're entirely wrong about everything they believe. I think a president should call on the American people to do something in their lives, even if it's for 5 minutes a day, to try to find some common ground with someone who disagrees with them politically. I think a president in their first 100 days should only have an agenda that has bipartisan proposals that currently exist in the Congress of the United States. As someone who served in the Congress and was ranked the 3rd most bipartisan member of the Congress, I know there are tremendous ideas that enjoy broad support on both sides of the aisle in criminal justice, in immigration, in infrastructure policy, in digital privacy. Go down the list. Wouldn't it be amazing if a president could look out at the American people and say, I represent every one of you, whether you voted for me or not? And to prove it, in my first 100 days, my agenda is these things. And every one of those items currently exists in the Congress on a bipartisan basis, word for word. So you can say, listen, your representatives, good-minded, both sides of the aisle, this is what they've agreed on, and that's what I'm going to do. And I think a president should call for national service. Not mandatory, but an exciting program where all the kids who graduate from high school would have an opportunity to serve their country, either in the military or through some new community service program where they go into different communities and we give them a break on their student loans for doing it, or maybe infrastructure, rebuilding our national parks, all the federal buildings that need to be upgraded for energy efficiency. They'd actually get a certificate, like they'd be a welder or a carpenter when they're done with that. Can you imagine if we called for this? We got all the athletes, all the movie stars, all the business leaders to get behind it. They went around the country. They convinced high school kids to sign up for this program. They got mixed up with kids. So kids from rural Iowa got mixed up with a kid from, inner city Boston, and they went to New Orleans to rebuild a national park. And they did this for 1 year. It's the kind of thing that would bring us together, and it would be great for those kids. So this is what I'm running on. I do believe the central question facing this country is how do we take this terribly divided nation and bring it back together? I think our current president is the divider-in-chief in many ways. I think he wakes up every day and tries to divide the country. But I don't even blame him, because I think he's a punctuation of decades of terrible politics. We have to fundamentally turn the chapter. We need new leaders, people who want to bring us together, people who want to restore a sense of common purpose and unity to this extraordinary country, a country that can do anything, but it has to do it all together. And we have to get back to the business of solving problems. We have to get back to the business of thinking about our future, restoring a sense of moral aspiration to our politics, and reminding each other that we can do so much better. That the answer to that question that was posed by you, Jim, as to what's next, is something really positive, something really exciting, where we feel better about our government, and in the process, we feel better about ourselves. And that is precisely the reason why I'm running for president. So I want to thank you for having me here today, and I'd love to hear any questions you all have. Thank you.
Very well done.
Thank you.
We have a few minutes to have questions asked of our very special guest. Maybe I could just ask the first question. Just looking at your agenda of issues that you're promoting, what I found very refreshing is that any issue that you're advocating, you put a price tag.
Yep.
Unlike other people who will talk about an issue but not really say, oh, how do we finance it? In particular, infrastructure. Infrastructure is so important to New England with our bridges and disrepair, roads, highways, airports. You talk about the way to address the infrastructure is to find the revenue by re-examining the corporate tax that was just passed, lowered to 21%. You say, let's increase it to 25%. And then you also talk about increasing the personal income tax from 37 to 39, where it was before the tax bill was passed. Your thoughts on how much would be raised there, and how realistic would that be in getting it passed?
So my original proposal for infrastructure was to create $1 trillion infrastructure program, and it was fully paid for. I had 40 Democrats, 40 Republicans supporting it, including the head of the Freedom Caucus, which is considered the most conservative group in the Congress, and I had the head of the Progressive Caucus on this bill, which shows you kind of how I operate. And the way I did it is I took the international tax system, which was flawed and kept all this money overseas, and I reformed that to create a way for it to repatriate back to the United States. And that generated a lot of money. And I took all that money and I allocated it towards infrastructure. In this last tax reform bill, they took half of my bill. They took the whole part that fixed the international tax system and they put it in almost word for word in the bill. But they kicked the infrastructure part out. And they used the tax revenues that were generated to basically lower rates. And I thought that was a bad deal. So what I would do, at a minimum, is I would increase the corporate tax rate from 21 to 25. That generates $400 billion. Every 1% of corporate tax rate generates $100 billion. And I would take the $400 billion and I would put it in the Highway Trust Fund, which is the main way we fund infrastructure, and I'd put in a new infrastructure bank, which could be used by jurisdictions for all types of infrastructure projects. And if you put $400 billion in those mechanisms and you combine that with the other money that comes from states and local governments, you get $1 trillion of infrastructure. So how much better would this tax reform bill have been if instead of cutting the corporate rate from 35, where it was too high, no question, we were not competitive at 35, if they would have cut it to 25 instead of 21 and had $1 trillion infrastructure program coming out of that bill. Imagine how different that would be. And the thing about 25 is, you know, I watched the business community, and listen, I ran 2 public companies. I was the youngest CEO in the history of the New York Stock Exchange. I get the corporate tax rate. My company's always paid the highest rate possible. We didn't have any loopholes or anything. No one in the business community even asked for 21. Like, the business community's position was 25. 25, if we could just get that rate to 25. President Obama proposed 27. And suddenly this bill comes out and it's 21. I was like, who even asked for that? So I would move it back 25 and we'd have $1 trillion of infrastructure.
What about the personal income tax?
So I would roll back, look, so what I think we should do to create more tax parity in this country, because I do think our tax system is structurally unfair. And I think it benefits the investor class and it hurts the working class. And so I would do something that's similar to what's called the Buffett rule, where you basically say that people who kind of earn money as an investor pay the same rate as people who earn money working. You know, if you go back and look at this country's history, there was a point in time where we needed to create an incentive for people to invest, which is why we had a low capital gains rate. But like a lot of things, the world has changed. Every single human being I know that has any assets to invest is investing them. I mean, do any of you know people who are just sitting on huge piles of cash other than they think the world's going to collapse? People who invest for a living are investing. We don't need a preferential tax. And we certainly don't need a class of individuals who invest for a living paying half the tax rate that people who work for a living. So I would roll back the high-end marginal rates, but I would also put in place this Buffett rule that basically synchronizes capital gains rates with ordinary income rates. Because that's, I think, the most, if we want to have a fair tax system with the concentration of wealth in this country the way it's headed, we can't allow people who already get a lion's share. And again, I'm a capitalist, right? So I'm not anti-capitalism. I think we got to make it more just and inclusive. And I think one of the ways you make it more just is you make sure that people who invest for a living pay the same tax rate as people who work for a living.
We have students that have the microphone, so when you raise your hand, will you just wait for the student to come and you can identify yourself? Okay.
So I'm Jason, I'm from New England College. With so many candidates running in the 2020 election on the Democratic side, how do you see yourself moving forward?
So I think I'm running basically a fundamentally different race to some extent. I mean, my campaign is about solving problems, focusing on the future, and bringing the country together. So I'm a unifier, not a divider. I'm a problem solver, not a goalpost mover. And I'm someone who's actually not trying to refight the battles of the past. I'm actually thinking about where the world is going. That makes me actually more of a centrist candidate, which I don't think is a dirty word, right? Because I think if we want to win as a party and we want to govern, two things that are very important in my opinion, winning and governing, we should be a big tent party. We should be the party that wants to attract progressives, moderates, independents, and what I call disaffected Republicans, in other words, non-Trump Republicans. I'd love to attract the Trump Republicans too, but I'll take the four that I just named, right? Because that's 60, 70% of the country. And like I said with my approach to carbon or climate change, which is let's put forth real proposals that actually get something done. That's a progressive idea to deal with climate change, so the progressives ought to support me. I was the Citizens Climate Legislator of the Year, so I'm really good on this issue. But I don't actually think the Green New Deal is the right way to go. And the reason is because I want to do something on climate tomorrow. I don't want to tie fixing climate to fixing healthcare. So what I'm trying to do is progressive, but I am solutions-oriented, which attracts moderates, independents, and disaffected Republicans. So I think if my party, the Democratic Party, and I understand this is a bipartisan group, but I think if my party wants to win, they need to nominate someone like me who can build that big tent. And the nice thing about that is we'll also be able to govern. Was there a mic over here?
Why don't you bring it over here to the Ambassador Bruno?
Hi, and good morning, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Do we have a crisis at the border, and is the appropriation of $25 billion the best use of that money? You were talking about infrastructure.
Yeah.
Is that part of the, should that be part of the U.S. infrastructure program?
No, when I think of an infrastructure program, I'm actually not thinking about the border in that context, right? I think about transportation, I think about communications, right? We don't have rural broadband in a lot of this country. I think we clearly need to upgrade our transportation infrastructure. Our water infrastructure is about 100 years old and collapsing all around us. Our energy infrastructure, we need a new smart grid. That's what I think about when we think about infrastructure. So I don't think $25 billion is the best use of the taxpayer money to build a wall from sea to shining sea, which is what the president wants. But do I think, as part of comprehensive immigration reform, we should be putting money towards border security? Absolutely. Did we have lax border security for a good part of our last several decades? Absolutely. And the way I would solve this border security crisis, I think, is really straightforward, which is I would agree with the Congress on a certain amount of money. And it feels like the dollars we're talking about are somewhere between $3 and $5 billion. So I'd say, okay, Congress and me as president, let's agree on $3 to $5 billion. We got a debate as to how to spend the money. Well, why don't we do what normal people would do? Let's get some experts, not politicians, not the president, but some people who actually understand border security, who are nonpartisan. And let's have them make a recommendation to us. We want to spend, let's say, $4 billion. Let's have them recommend the best way to spend $4 billion on our border. And I think what they would come back with is the following. They'd say, I want technology along most of it, sensors, drones, high-powered cameras on very tall poles. They'd want some personnel at certain parts. And they might want some barriers at certain parts. But I would say to my Republican colleagues, I'm like, you and I agree that whatever those experts recommend, we accept. We decide the amount of money, and we'll take their recommendations. Meaning, if they come back with a recommendation that has no barriers, you, the president, or Trump have to agree to that. But similarly, if they come back with a recommendation that has some barriers, you, the Democrats, have to agree to that. That's how I would deal with this issue, right? This is a practical, tactical issue about the best way to use the taxpayer money to secure our border. And instead, it's become this kind of political debate about our values as a country. I'd want to get it back to actually, let's just get it done. We have so many other issues to deal with. That's how I think about it, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you.
Pat McDermott.
Yes, Pat.
Hi, Pat McDermott, excuse me, AARP, New Hampshire, volunteer. Americans continue to pay the highest prescription drug prices in the world. No one should have to choose between buying food and taking their medicine. Do you agree drug prices are too high? And if so, how would you specifically work to lower prescription drug prices and reduce costs for all Americans?
So it's a great question, Pat. The answer is yes, I agree with that they're too high. So there's two things I would do. One that gets a lot of attention and a lot of people agree with. The second that gets no attention is actually more important. So the first thing I would do is allow the government to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies. Right now, as you know, the federal government is prohibited by law from using its buying power through Medicare to negotiate with these pharmaceutical companies. So it's the equivalent of Walmart not being able to negotiate prices. I mean, it's crazy. It's a wealth transfer from the taxpayers of the United States to the shareholders of the pharmaceutical companies. So that's one thing we should do. But that's actually not even the most important thing. The most important thing in terms of pharmaceutical drug pricing is the fact that the rest of the world is free riding on the U.S. citizens. And what I mean by that is if you go to the other developed countries, forget about poor countries. I think we should sell drugs to poor countries at very low prices. But let's talk about Germany or France or Spain. Citizens in those countries pay about a third of what we do for pharmaceutical prices. And the reason they pay a third is because they have one person who negotiates a rate, and every single person in the country pays that rate, no matter where, no matter how it's bought. And so this is what the pharmaceutical companies do, is they basically get whatever they can from those countries, which is somewhere between cost and less than cost. And then they come back to the United States, and they raise the prices here to fund their whole business model. So the citizens of the United States of America are basically underwriting the whole drug discovery business. And then we allow the drugs to be sold. So I would make this a trade issue, because I want the pharmaceutical companies to lower their prices here and raise them in other countries. And it's not like I just want to raise them in other countries just to hurt the citizens there. I don't. But I know that unless we get their prices up, our prices will never go down. Because the pharmaceutical companies always say, hey, we need to make a certain amount of money to invest in all this innovation. And to some extent, they're right. I mean, are their margins too high? You could certainly argue that. But they do need some profit margin to invest in new drugs. So I would either make it a trade issue, where we're actually bringing those countries to the table, or I would do the following, which is a provocative idea, but it really makes a point. I would pass a new tax. And this tax would go as follows. Pharmaceutical companies owe 100% tax on the difference between where they sell their drugs in the United States versus where they sell them in the G20. So if you want to sell drugs more expensive here than there, you're going to pay all your profits back to us. So what that'll do is force them to raise the prices there and lower them here so they're the same and they don't pay the tax. Now, in some ways, that's not a realistic proposal, but it shows how I think about it. So I want the government to negotiate these prices, but I also want to bring the prices down here and raise them globally, because it's unfair to our citizens to allow everyone else in the developed world, not the poor countries, in the developed world, to effectively free ride on the fact that the United States citizens fund the whole pharmaceutical industry. So that's what I would do. Yes, sir. Okay, sorry.
What is your proposal to move health care from an employment benefit to a human right?
Great. So the first thing I would do is fix the Affordable Care Act in my first 100 days. And then the second thing is I would roll out my plan for universal health care, which would make health care a right of every American citizen. But I wouldn't do it with the Medicare for All bill that currently exists in the U.S. Senate, which I do not think is good policy. And I'll tell you why, but what I'm first going to do is tell you how I would do it. So I think Medicare is actually the only part of the healthcare system in this country that works. People like Medicare. Most people who receive Medicare are pretty happy with the program. It's got a pay for that doesn't pay for the whole thing, but it has a revenue stream paying for it. And if you were to actually take a step back and look at the U.S. healthcare system, you'd say, well, that kind of works. So let's leave that alone, right? Because that's the part of the system that works. So what I would do is I would create a new healthcare program for everyone from when they're born to when they're 65. And then over 65, they go to Medicare. Under this new program, we would roll Medicaid into it, right? So everyone would get health care as a right from when they're born to their 65. But then they would have the ability to buy supplemental plans. So just like Medicare, most people who have Medicare also buy a supplemental. I would create a similar model for everyone under 65, where you get a base health care program as a right, but you also have the ability to buy a supplemental program. So you can have choices and you can have options. And the way I would pay for that system is to basically take away the corporate deductibility of healthcare. So right now, we spend $4 trillion over 10 years through lower corporate tax revenues because we allow corporations to deduct the cost of healthcare, and we don't actually make the individual who gets the healthcare treat it as income. So there's this massive loophole. I would close that, take away the corporate deductibility of healthcare, and use that to fund universal expansion of a basic healthcare program that everyone gets as a right. So if you're poor, you have healthcare. If you're between jobs, you have healthcare. If you want to go start a business like I did, you don't have to worry about your healthcare. You can try to get better jobs and move and not have to worry about your healthcare decision, right? Because I think everyone should have it as a right. But I do think the American people want options, right? So the way I envision the system is you get a basic plan, and then you can buy supplementals. And if you work for a company, let's say you work, I know there was a gentleman here from Bank of America. Let's say you work at Bank of America and you have Aetna and you really like it. So suddenly I've rolled out a program where Bank of America doesn't get a deduction anymore. But the employees probably like their health care. So that would work out fine, because what Bank of America would then do is they'd go to Aetna and they'd negotiate a group supplemental plan for all their employees. And so the people who are at Bank of America would basically go from having Aetna as their primary insurance to having an Aetna supplemental, and they'd have their government plan. And Aetna would basically merge the government plan into their supplemental and would feel like they still have Aetna. So that to me is a system that is both fiscally sound, we can afford it, it gives health care to everyone, but the way it does it is by having a basic government plan and then a private market that floats on top. And it's really important as a matter of economics, when we think about healthcare reform, to remember a very important point. And that is that right now the government does not reimburse the cost of healthcare. So if you look at the Medicaid program in this country, it pays 80% of costs. If you look at the Medicare program in this country, it pays 95% of costs. And private insurance pays about 115 to 120% of costs. So if you went to every hospital in this country who last year, if you look at the data, they received half in reimbursement from Medicare that they received in commercial insurance for the exact same procedure. So if you get the exact same procedure done in a hospital and Medicare paid the bill, it was half what commercial insurance paid. If you go to all those hospitals and say, how do you feel about a plan where Medicare is the only payer, and last year you would get half in reimbursement from all those commercial insurance payments you got, they would be half the amount. a bunch of hospitals I spoke to said, well, we would close because Medicare and Medicaid don't actually cover our costs. So I don't think we can transition to a system where the government is the only payer, because I'm not comfortable the government will actually ever pay costs. And if the government doesn't pay costs, we're going to have very low quality health care, and we're going to have very limited access to health care in this country. So I think we should use Medicare as a model without, quote, Medicare for all, where we should have a basic health care plan as a right and the ability to buy supplementals. That gives us universal access, and it preserves access quality, and I think over time it can lead to lower costs. So that's my proposal for health care reform.
Gentleman over in the back here. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, Joe Murray from Fidelity Investments in Merrimack. I think it's easy to agree that there is a great divide in our politics and between our politicians. I'm interested to hear what wisdom you would impart to the voters who really just now are starting to plug into this race. I'm not asking you to criticize your potential constituents, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about that, what their role is in this election.
Well, the voters play the most important role in the election, which is to elect our leaders, obviously. And what I always say to voters is I want everyone to vote. I want you to find your friends who don't vote and get them to vote. And, you know, I think everyone has a responsibility to actually pay attention to what's going on and try to become familiar with the issues. But I do think what I tell voters they should consider is they should consider whether they actually like what politics has been like the last 20 years or not. And they should ask themselves a question whether we could have different politics. Because that, I think, is the most important question for the American people to ask themselves, which is, what do you want your future to look like? Do you want us to actually start getting real things done for your kids and your grandkids? Because at the end of the day, what compels most Americans, I believe, is not only what affects them in their day-to-day lives, the kitchen table issues like healthcare and education and their job and their pay, but also this notion of what kind of world they're leaving for their kids and their grandkids. And I think most Americans understand that the world we're headed towards is not the world we want, where these economic trends are going to continue, we're going to leave our kids these debts they can't repay, and that we're potentially looking at a world, and I don't say this to be overly dramatic, but I think it's true, where every political disagreement in the future could be met with a violent protest, right? Literally, when there's a disagreement about anything on the Congress, right, there'll be violent protests outside the Capitol, not only in Washington, but every state capital in this country. And these protests will be fueled by disinformation wars, right, which are becoming easier and easier to do in the technology world that we live in. And that's not a future any of us want. We want a future where we actually tackle some of these problems, solve some of these problems. You know that old campsite rule, you leave the place better than you found it? We got to get back to that. And the way we got to get back to that is working together, finding common ground, and getting things done. So that's my advice. And I think the young generation in particular, I mean, the young generation grew up in a world where these devices allowed them to go around whatever they don't like. So they look at the world and they say, I don't like that. Well, there's got to be some app that allows me to kind of work around that. And that's the generation you all have grown up in. And my sense is you're coming to this political system and you're looking at it and you're saying, God, this thing is terrible. These people have totally failed us. You know, 97% of the country wants universal background checks, but you haven't done it in the Congress, and issue after issue. And so I just think that the young generation in particular needs to be focused on solutions. Because unless we solve these problems, it's really, they're going to pay the price. So that's kind of what I talk to voters about. Orrin?
Just wait.
Yep.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. I'm Warren Falkowitz. Can you speak to your views on what we can do to make a measurable and positive impact on cybersecurity in this country?
Well, let me start a little macro, which is I've called for a national AI strategy, which includes cybersecurity. And I think it should have a couple of components. It should have what we do about work and how it's changing. It should deal with national security and cybersecurity. It should deal with digital privacy. and it should deal with programming bias, because a lot of the decisions that human beings make today, as you know, are going to be made by machines in the future. And it matters who programs them and do they have any inherent biases. So I've called for this kind of comprehensive artificial intelligence strategy that's developed by the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector. Now, a component of that is cyber. And we don't, as best I can tell, have a terrific cybersecurity strategy at this point. As you and I have talked about, and I thought your insight was particularly good on this point, which is we can solve any problem in this country if we actually get the data. And one of the problems with all the cyber attacks is that a lot of them go unreported and unknown, and we don't actually have a depository where people are actually gathering the data so that they can do the best analytics as to who the attackers are and what kind of defenses we need to do. So in addition to upgrading our military for cyber, which is incredibly important, and I actually think they're lagging. Right? One of the reasons I think our military is lagging is because we spent 15, 16, 17 years fighting all these wars in the Middle East. And Russia and China looked at our capabilities and said, well, we can't compete with them conventionally, but we can compete with them in the cyber world. And they upgraded their capabilities massively, and we basically lagged. So we clearly have to upgrade our military. And I think more of our military spending needs to go towards technology and cyber and a little less towards hardware. But I also think to protect the American people, we need to create more of a depository for getting real information as to what these attacks are, how they happen, who does them, so that we can build better tools to protect the American people.
If I could just ask a question on trade.
Sure.
Trade is an issue that both parties have been very critical of, and yet trade is so important. In particular, New England, we're very concerned about the new NAFTA updated bill. And that seems to be in trouble now, even though the president has signed off on it, Mexico signed off on it, Canada signed off. Members of Congress on both sides, Republicans are saying, we don't really like the language in there because there's language in there that's restrictive on trade. And Democrats are saying there's not enough strong language in there to protect labor and environment. What kind of a president will you be on trade?
So probably the best way I can answer that question is to say that I was a supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was an initiative by President Obama to actually put in place a new 14-nation trade pact that included NAFTA, and in many ways the new NAFTA is TPP, right, at least part of it. And then it also included a bunch of Asian countries, not China. And I thought it was incredibly important, not only for economic matters, right, but trade agreements are always positive and negative economically. The problem with them historically is we didn't do anything about the negatives. Like, we absorbed the positives and we accepted those, but we didn't do the kind of things to take care of all these communities that were left behind. But I also think it's particularly important from a geopolitical standpoint. So that's kind of how I think about it. I'm a believer in the post-World War II model of U.S. foreign engagement, which to me is the U.S. engaging diplomatically, economically, and from time to time militarily to build a world order for peace and security. And I think economics is a big part of that. I would never have a meeting overseas without my chief diplomat and my chief economic advisor in the room at the same time, because I think they're inextricably linked. And so I was supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership because I think China is the #1 foreign policy threat for the next several decades, by far, by any measure. They act like pirates. They steal technology. They build illegal islands. They're engaging in disinformation campaigns here in our own country. I don't want to be their enemy, but we have to be clear-eyed about what they're doing. And they become our rival economically by doing three things. They worked hard, they made smart investments, but they also didn't play by the rules. We can't allow them to do that in the future. And so one of the ways of dealing with China is competing with them in their backyard. And that's one of the reasons I was a big supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because it gave us a seat at the table of a block of nations, not just a seat, the head of the table, of a block of nations that controlled 40% of the Asian economy, which is the fast-growing economy in the world. And so that's how I think about trade. I think isolationism and nationalism is the wrong answer to every question we could possibly ask ourselves. And that we have to be engaging, and that not only means diplomacy, but it includes economics. And diplomacy is a big part of it too, as is foreign aid. I mean, the ambassador asked a question about the border. I was down at the border a month ago. My wife and I flew to the border, and we took 14 Georgetown law students with us. She's the chair of the board of Georgetown Law School. And and we took 14 law students, and we took 2 law professors, and we heard asylum cases for a week. So we went to a detention facility where 1,700 women and children are being detained, and we helped them process their asylum cases so that they could seek asylum in this country. And so I sat there and listened to women and tell their stories about what was happening in Central America. And it's a great reminder not only why we need asylum, right? Because if you heard these stories, you would understand exactly why these people are coming here, and every one of you would have done the same thing. But you also understand why the answer to a lot of our problems that people are concerned about, immigration, et cetera, is making sure we have a foreign aid program and diplomatic efforts to actually build up some of these economies. Because the answer to our immigration at the southern border is actually to do things with our regional partners to fix Central America. But that's how I think about engagement. Yes, sir.
Hi, Congressman Delaney. Excuse me. My name is Caleb. I'm a student at Saint Anselm College.
Hey, Caleb.
Thank you for coming to New Hampshire.
Sure.
I wanted to go back to what you were talking about when you mentioned bipartisanship.
Yep.
I do agree we need to return to bipartisanship and unity. And I know you said you have a plan to only talk about bills that are already bipartisan in the Congress, but especially with what's been happening and how we see Congress getting more and more divided, especially with the shutdown and potentially another one looming, do you really believe that will be enough to return to unity?
I don't think it's enough in and of itself, right? And just to be clear what I said, in my first 100 days, right? Because I think the first 100 days really determine the tone of your presidency. So I think what I'm proposing is incredibly hard to do, but it's the right thing to do, right? What's that expression? You're never wrong to do the right thing. And I understand, and everyone always says how hard it is to bring the country together. Particularly, I got to say, and I don't want to sound partisan, with the Republicans in the Congress are actually very different than Republicans nationwide because of gerrymandering. You know, it's a boiled down subset of people to some extent. So it's not actually representative of what I think you can do with normal human beings. But I think you got to do, I don't mean that as negatively as it sounds, but like, again, like 97% of the American people support common sense universal background checks. Literally 97% of the American people. And yet that bill doesn't pass in the House, right? Because that means the people elected don't actually represent the people. They represent the extremes in the parties. And I just think we got to turn the chapter on this, what I call several decades of the extremes holding the country hostage. That's kind of what we've had. So this is what I propose. Tone at the top matters. So what should the president do? I think the president's got to wake up every day and try to do something to bring the country together. Right? I think a president should swear never to divide the country. Literally, that should be part of the oath of office. Sometimes it'll be hard. Sometimes you got to bite your tongue. Now, that doesn't mean you don't stand up for hate. That doesn't mean you don't condemn people in Charlottesville and never imply a moral equivalency between protesters of racism and people who are protesting the protesters of racism, right? So standing up for hate is different than not unifying, right, or being committed to always unify the country. I think a president should debate the Congress every quarter. So I literally believe the President of the United States, and I've called for this, should go to the floor of the House of Representatives once every 3 months on national television, 3 hours. Everyone will watch it, and have a debate. First of all, the president ought to be able to do it. I'm just saying. But secondly, I think it would be amazing for the American people. And the way I envision it is you have 3 hours. First hour and a half is one issue. Healthcare, right? Immigration, trade, right? Foreign policy, cybersecurity, whatever the case may be. First hour and a half. And then the second hour and a half is open questions. And the reason I think that's so important is, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, the American people are having a little bit of a hard time with the truth. I mean, the truth is the truth. We all know that. But it's become a little bit elusive in the political debate, right? And you have people coming to the table with differing facts. And as Senator Moynihan always said, you know, you can't bring differing facts to a debate, right? We can have different opinions, but we got to agree on the facts. And I think social media has contributed to this. And again, I believe in technology and innovation, all this stuff, but I think it's made it hard. And I actually think what the American people need is almost old-fashioned town square type debates, like what you do here in New Hampshire all the time. Right? I bet I get the voters in New Hampshire I bet they're a little more in tune to what's going on and what actually the facts are because of what you go through every 4 years than people in other parts of the country. So I would like to bring that debate to the American people, because I actually think the American people will figure out who's telling the truth. I think it'll also force politicians to be more honest. Because if you're debating someone on national television, you got to go back and forth with them 20 times, you're going to be fact-checked, right? You're going to be fact-checked. So I think things like that. So I think calling for national service, how you conduct yourself and talk about things, the intentional things you do to unify, like first 100-day agenda, debating the Congress, and then most importantly, appealing to the American people, calling upon them, and acknowledging, which I would in my inauguration, that I can't do this alone. No single person can do it alone. It's up to everyone to try to do something in their day. And I think what that will do, all of those things together, putting our shoulder behind them completely, will move the needle just enough to get us in a point where we start getting some things done. And then that becomes virtuous. And let me give you one example. Pretty soon after President Trump became the president, we had a debt ceiling issue. It was in September, right, of 2017. And the debt ceiling was coming up, and no one was sure how it was going to get raised. And we thought we were going to trip the debt ceiling. And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell went to the Oval Office and sat down with the president and Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary. And they had a debate about what to do. And it was a pretty famous moment. And they agreed to some lame deal to extend the debt ceiling for 3 months, right? And I say lame, it's like, of course you have to extend the debt ceiling. It's not even a discussion. But the approval rating of the American people of that was 92%. So something that you normally should take 5 minutes in a normal day to do, yeah, well, of course we got to raise the debt ceiling. It's a silly metric anyhow, was so overwhelmingly well received by the American people because we actually did something. I believe we have a border deal cut. It's not finalized yet, or I haven't followed the news this morning, but it sounds like there's a deal cut. I believe that will enjoy enormous support by a large number of the American people. They won't even care what's in it, but the fact that they got something done. And so my point is, if you do enough intentional things and you actually change the dynamic enough so you can start getting some things done, then that starts feeding on itself and it changes the thing. Because the one thing I've learned in my life, having started to do businesses and done the various things I've done with my life, things change fast. You just got to get it moving in the right direction.
Well, it's 9:30. We want to make sure that we stay on schedule, and we just want to thank the congressman for coming by. I think we're going to see more of him in this great state, and really enjoyed your thoughtful remarks.
Thank you, Jim.
Good luck.
Thanks for having me.
Are you kidding? We'll have you back. Yeah. There's a zipper and everything.
Great. I love both these both bags. Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, John.
For that nice introduction.
Thank
you.
I'm glad to hear you want to unite the country because I think that's the biggest problem.
Yep.
The other thing on the universal check for guns.
Universal what?
When they check for the guns.
Yes. Background checks.
The thing is, it's what's added into the words that they don't get it passed.
I know.
97% of us want
Because that's because people put poison pills in.
Exactly.
Because that's because they don't want to actually do it.
So
Yes, sure.
You know the tradition.
Yeah, I do.
Thank you. On the Medicare, with the for everyone, are you proposing that everybody gets it up to 65 and it's paid for
by the government?
By the government.
And then they buy supplements.
Okay. So at 65, I start paying for it?
No.
Because it comes out of my Social Security check now. So basically,
you're in Medicare now.
Yes.
So nothing would change for you.
That's what I'm saying, because I pay for it out of my Social Security
Which is the other
check.
reason why I don't think we should be running around saying Medicare for all. I don't think we should take something you paid for and give it to everyone else.
L-I-N-D. A lot of S-thousand that are really going to be affected by...
Well, you realize when you sign books, there's a lot of different ways people spell their name.
It's true. And I just want to say, I am actually a young attorney and a modern Democrat, so everything you just spoke to me was incredible for my internal problem-solving need. So.
Well, you found your candidate.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We'll be seeing you tomorrow?
Yes, we'll be seeing you tomorrow.
I'm excited.
Yes. 2 of our representatives that weren't able to show up today. Due to class.
Thank you for your perspective.
Thank you. It's a different perspective.
It is. I like where it's coming from.
Good. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Governor Delaney.
I just want to shake your hand.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome to New Hampshire.
Thank
Glad
you.
you came.
Thank you.
I like what I hear.
Good. I love your support. Thank you.
Thank you for your work in Maryland. I live right outside your district
you did?
in Westminster.
Thank you. What's that?
What you're doing isn't hard.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Hey.
I just wanted to say I'm from the Canadian consulate in Boston, and I really appreciated your comments on trade. And
Oh, yeah.
the
Well, Canada's a great
importance of
partner.
it. Thank you. Hello.
Hey, how are you? How are
Saint
you?
Anselm College.
Thanks. Hey there, Ty, right?
Yep.
There you go, Ty.
Love the speech.
Yes.
Everyone signed the state that they're from, so would you mind?
You want me to just sign here or write you a note? And then sign here?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Heather Carroll from the Alzheimer's Association.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. I'd love to get a photo. All right, let's take a couple. Awesome.
Thanks, Heather. Nice to meet you.
Abby Theobald.
Abby, nice to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Your photo?
Thank you. I might also just sign it.
Sure.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you. Good luck.
Hey there.
Will Sheik from Freedom Energy Logistics.
What's your name again? Spell A-B. Thanks, Abu. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Good question.
Yeah, thank you. Mind if we grab a picture?
Let's do it. Hey.
I appreciated the focus on fiscal policy.
Sure. What's your name again?
Tyler.
Thank you, sir. Sure. Hey there.
How are you?
Good.
Pleasure.
Nice to see you.
Thanks for coming up. Appreciate it. I thought it was awesome that you were talking about service and stuff today.
Yes.
It's actually, my thesis is on
Oh, good.
morality and capitalism, so I was like, oh, this is perfect.
I got a chapter in my book on it, so grab a book. Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
Good. Nice
Thank
to see
you.
you.
Appreciate it.
Morning. Thank you so much
Sure.
for being here.
Sure. What do you do?
I'm a professor at New England College.
Oh, super. What are you a professor in?
Political science. Of course.
Yeah. Hey. Okay. Who should I make it out to?
C-A-R-L-I-E.
L-I-E.
My parents were weird.
Wow. There's a lot of cool names out there.
Thank you so much.
Trevor, T-R-E-V-O-R. Thank you so much, sir.
Sure.
See you tomorrow.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trevor. Hey.
Thank you. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Very good.
Can we get a quick picture?
Yeah, let's do it.
Thank you. Thank you. Want a picture, Neil? Sure.
There you go.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, John. We're going to do a photo back there with all the students.
Super.
Yep. Hey, folks, we're doing a photo.
Yeah, we're gonna go do a photo.
Everybody, back at that.
Here's Saint Anselm.
Congressman Delaney, how do you think, having been on the trail for 2 years, do you get the sense it's made you a better candidate already?
Oh, yeah. I mean, listen, like anything else, practice makes perfect. But what really happens is you have to listen to people. And you have to hear what their concerns are. Because part of this is actually learning, and learning from the voters and people out there telling them stories in their living rooms and in coffee shops. So it tunes you into really the issues that people really care about. And that's a big part of the job. I mean, we're supposed to represent the people, but we got to be listening to them.
A little bit of a minefield these days in the Democratic Party in terms of when you talk about the Green New Deal. How do you, you have your own ideas, you don't necessarily support it, but how do you convey to the younger generation that really has the energy behind this, that you are listening to them, even if you don't agree with them on policy?
Well, because what I say to them is, listen, the energy you're bringing to this is terrific, and I totally support the energy. I totally support that you're shining a bigger spotlight on this. But what really matters is to actually get something done. And so what I have to do is be honest with them. And if I'm being honest with them, I'm saying, if we want to actually make a difference on climate change, we have to do something right away. And it's got to be big. And there are some things we can do that are big right away. So let's not do things to make that harder. So if you actually tie climate change to universal health care, then you're like making it 5 times harder to do anything on climate change. right? So it's stuff like that that I'm just honest with them. And I think they get it, because it's not that I'm against the energy they're bringing. I'm actually totally in favor of it. But I also want to be the president that solves these problems and gets things done. So I'm honest with them about how I prepare, how I plan to do that.
You said centrist is not a dirty word. I thought that
Yes.
was interesting. But when you look at a lot of your rivals for the nomination, are they too extreme? Are they too far to the left?
Listen, I don't spend a lot of time kind of criticizing my rivals. I think I'm the only one who's running as a problem solver. And I think there's two ways of kind of seeking the presidency. You can try to divide and create some goals that are unrealistic. I think that's wrong. I don't think that serves the common good of the country. Or you can actually try to unify the country and actually show people how you're going to get real things done during your presidency to make a difference in their lives. And I think that's the right way to not only be the president, but to run for the office. And that's what I'm doing. So I think I'm right. Does that mean I think they're wrong? That's not my business to say, but I know what I'm doing is right.
Congressman, do you think that taking that route, especially these days, is a more difficult and challenging path?
No, because I think what I'm talking about is what most Americans believe. It may not be what gets the most attention. There is this notion of the loudest voices in the room don't necessarily reflect the consensus in the room. I think what I'm speaking to, is the great center of our country, which, by the way, includes a majority of Democrats. I mean, I forgot which pollsters did a poll, and they went to Democratic primary voters, and they say, do you prefer someone who actually wants to compromise to get things done, or do you prefer someone who wants to stick rigidly to their ideological beliefs? It was like 86-4. So I'm running where the 86% of the people are. I think my opponents are running where the 4% of the people are. So I don't actually think it's harder. I think you have to cut through a little more, because there's a bit of a wall of noise around what the experts say the party wants, but I don't actually think it's what they want.
Do you think you're, I don't know how to put it, there's so many diverse
Yes.
people in the field. If you could address that as a Caucasian male,
Yes.
Is it more challenging in this particular field in that way as well?
So listen, I think the fact that we have a really diverse field is terrific. I think the fact that the Democratic Party is diverse and represents the American people, I think that's terrific. I'm not a woman, I'm not a person of color. I can't fully appreciate the experiences that they've had to deal with in their lives, because they've had unique challenges. But what I can say that I will represent those interests, and I believe the Democratic Party is ultimately going to elect the person who they think is the right leader, right, who can lead the country in the right direction. So I think diversity is a great strength of our party, and I think we're seeing that in the presidential field, and I think that's terrific, right? I think it's terrific. But I don't think at the end of the day that will be the defining question that most voters ask themselves. They're going to say, who's the best leader?
You put out a bunch of mailers, Christmas cards. I got one as an independent voter here in the state over the holidays. Are you? What's next? Are we going to see some commercials?
Yeah. I mean, we've run a bunch of commercials in Iowa. We didn't do them here last year. We did them in Iowa. Yeah, listen, we're running a real campaign. I mean, I think we've got 6 people now here on the ground in New Hampshire. We've got about 24 on the ground in Iowa, and we've got about, call it, close to 20 people in our headquarters. So I think we have more people in our campaign than all the other campaigns combined at this point. So we're clearly going to keep it up.
So this is not your concern at the moment, but Democrats want to know how you're going to be able to defeat Donald Trump. Do you have a plan for that? Is there, when you're face to face with him in a debate, do you know how you're going to handle that?
Yeah, I know how we're going to handle that. So the plan to beat him is simple. Make sure progressives, moderates, independents, and disaffected Republicans want to vote for me, and then you beat him easily, right? So that Big Ten approach, that big coalition approach, that beats him easily, right? Because his group of core supporters does not represent a majority of the country. But in terms of how you deal with them, you got to always talk to the American people about what you're going to do for them. You can't run the race based on how bad he is. You have to run the race based on what you're going to do. Now, he's going to lie, and he's going to throw some punches. And I'm from Jersey. I know how to throw a punch back. So you're going to have to do some of that. But at the end of the day, you always got to be pivoting back to what are you going to do for the American people.
All right. Did they throw a lot of punches out in Woodbridge?
Woodbridge was a blue-collar town. So I'll leave it at that.
He's a Patterson guy.
Yeah, Patterson, they threw a lot of punches. You know where Woodbridge is.
Of course.
Yeah.
He makes fun.
We're off to Rochester.
Yeah. Well, Woodridge has more in Patterson than it does Westchester County, wouldn't you say?
My parents eventually moved to Fairlawn when I was in college. Yeah, I was brought up there.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
Good.
I heard you, it was a little cold yesterday at Coakley Landfill. That's what,
A little bit.
yeah.
It was fine,
A
though.
little windy.
It was fine. It was a little icy. We weren't able to do the full walk.
Yeah.
Which I didn't argue. When they said, I don't think we should go down there, I didn't say, no, I insist we go down there. It was good. It was good. Nice to see you all. Thanks, Adam. Thank you. Good to see you.
Congressman, appreciate it.
Yeah.
John, he signed these
Cool.
posters here.
My daughter still talks about when we both interviewed you last summer.
Yes, I remember that.
She's still into that. If she could vote, I think she'd vote for you.
Well, I love that.
And
Get a book for her.
just get a couple more eggs for the Institute.
Sure.
Thank
Oops.
you. Marcus running out.
Exactly. You got to actually really push.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great to have you. I'm sure we'll see you guys again soon.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say hello to you. I'm Greg Smith.
Hello, Greg.
Former Attorney General here.
Nice to see you,
I
Greg.
enjoyed your remarks very
Thank
much.
you very much.
Glad to see you engaged and inspired and centrist.
Yes. That's what the country needs.
Yes, exactly. Talking substantively about issues.
Right.
Thank you very much for
I think you need a plan, and the plan has to include not only what's the right policy, but how you're going to get it done.
I understand.
I mean, you get it.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll look forward to seeing you.
Absolutely.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with